Welcome to our second Twed of the spring 2015 term. This is our, so as we explained in the last Twed 2 weeks ago, what we're trying to do this term is to be more interactive, more discussion-oriented. We kept these tables in sort of a roundtable format. Tonight's Twed is Dominic's nth Twed since he's been here. We're Dominic DiFranzo is going to lead us in a discussion on the philosophy of linked data. This is meant to be a very interactive discussion, and hopefully the people on the Google Hangouts will feel free to join in the discussion as well. Please bear with us. Obviously, we're using, instead of Ustreaming, which is kind of a one-directional thing, we're trying to make this more interactive. Please feel free to interrupt if there's something you don't understand. This is kind of like Lindsay Poyer's talk from the kicked off last term's Tweds. This is a different angle on this interface between technology and technology philosophy, social issues, policy issues than we tend to normally think about. And some of the terminology may be different than what you're used to, and we want to make sure that's clear. Once again, we're going out onto the internet forever, so just keep that in mind when you ask questions or make comments. I don't think there's any other issues. This will be posted. This will be available through the Twed website. Also, if you to other topics this term. In 2 weeks, Christine is going to lead us in a talk on the future of privacy. 2 weeks after that, Matt is going to lead us on a very hands-on workshop, basically a micro workshop on Open Modeler and using Open Modeler to model environmental data, whatever.
Spatial data.
Spatial data. Very exciting, and I'll send out some highlights or some updates about that. He's going to coach us on setting up, but I think it would be advantageous to set up ahead of time. So without any further delay, kick it off now.
Hi. Yeah, so like John talked about, this is really just more of a discussion thing. I'm not really here to lecture or to talk about a bunch of new ideas. Mostly just about some reading that I've had through my thesis and through some work that I've been doing. I wanted to open up to the rest of the lab and get some outside input and get some new ideas and discussion, arguments, whatever it is, and kind of discuss that. And so we'll kind of just I'm just going to introduce some of these main ideas, some of the things that I've been reading and talking about, and define some of these concepts a little bit better, very, very broadly, of course, and in a very shallow way. Kind of define a little bit about the space, and then open it up to the floor in terms of just wanting to add on, wanting to talk, whatever that is. So the main kind of post of this kind of discussion, kind of this ties into my thesis, is I've been reading this book by George Landau called HyperText, in which he talks about hypertextual systems. And a lot of the ideas in critical theory, postmodernism, and poststructuralism have a lot of similarity between each other, both somewhat intentionally and unintentionally. And that there's this interesting relationship between the two of kind of critical theory and poststructuralism, postulating a lot of these interesting ideas, and hypertext being almost like a digital realization of some of those concepts. And he talks a little about some of the history and background behind these two different areas, and whether that was on purpose or by accident, but he kind of bridges those two things together. So basically, his main hypothesis is that hypertext systems and poststructuralism argue that we kind of have to abandon some old concepts, particularly kind of concepts founded on hierarchy, on centering concepts, but having like the concept of an author being the authoritative voice inside of a text, or authoritative voice inside of a concept. And then we need to kind of replace this with kind of more different ideas of kind of like a network and links and webs, and that knowledge and information is best expressed, is best exposed kind of as this, and that hypertext systems kind of realize that a bit in terms of how they're kind of created. And my kind of further on question is that, as Lando kind of makes this distinction or this comparison between the two, hypertext and poststructuralism, my question is whether linked data follows the same way. If linked data systems also encompass and encapsulate some of the post-structural ideas and concepts as well, much like hypertext does. So I'm going to define a little bit about, kind of, if you don't understand, some of the ideas of post-structuralism and a little bit about hypertext systems. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but of course not go into great super detail. The big thing of post-structuralism is seen as a response and add to, and also critique of structuralism that came out of the particular philosophical movement came out of the 50s and 60s. Basically, structuralism was looking at the overriding global structure behind different social and cultural artifacts and phenomenon. That there was this overriding structure that underwrite beneath it, and that if you wanted to really understand something, you wanted to go dig deeper to find out what the overriding structure behind it could actually be. Post-structuralism was a bit of a response to that, both critique and kind of addition to. It kind of thought there was the idea that signs themselves, like words, symbols, whatever it is, that they don't have one fixed meaning. In fact, symbols and words and concepts have multiple, wide variety of different type of meanings. Derrida, a very famous philosopher and kind of one of the forefathers of post-structuralism, although he probably wouldn't want to admit that, was kind of talking about the meaning is constantly being deferred. That signifiers don't just point to a single meaning, but they themselves also point to other signs. So that it's not just that signs don't have one fixed meaning, but that the meaning isn't real truth either. That what it's really pointing to is in itself also another sign, and that it kind of keeps going on and stuff like that. That signs are pointing to other signs. Derrida also kind of criticized kind of this ascendancy inside of structuralism and also kind of popular philosophy of the day of looking at kind of binary oppositions of between things, whether things being classical or contemporary, of male and female, these different kind of binaries we kind of see constructed up, and we kind of build these binaries and how we think about things and think about signs and structures. And a lot of his work was trying to challenge those binaries and saying, well, maybe there's places in the middle. Not only that, but that many times those binaries have a implicit hierarchy to them of one being better than the other, and that there's a lot of implicit knowledge kind of baked inside of those binaries. And some of his work was trying to challenge others to what he would call deconstructors, to be able to kind of tear apart those binaries a little bit, try to look at what are the assumptions, what are the ideas kind of behind that, and see if there's what's the bigger picture here. Pretend that we don't really know what these binaries actually mean, and see if there's space in the middle between that. And a lot of famous theorists and other social scientists kind of use some of these ideas and concepts to explain everything from different ideas in gender theory, and feminism, and sexuality, and STS and science and technology studies, etc. They kind of use a lot of these same ideas to kind of challenge these different binary ideas. There's a big idea as well. Foucault, also another very famous philosopher during his time period, talked about kind of I'm going to talk about this more now anyway. He also talked a lot about kind of text in terms of reading a book or any type of information like that. It's more of a link than just the book itself. When you read a book, that book isn't a standalone on itself. That book is pointing to a lot of other ideas and concepts outside of itself. That there are things on the edges that are never really clear cut. You can't just say your sociology book exists in and of itself. It links and references a bunch of other ideas, both explicitly in terms of like actual citations inside of the book, but also implicitly. When Shakespeare borrowed a lot of different ideas and concepts from the writers before him that he read and was inspired by, there's a lot of implicit linking between his concepts and ideas and that of other authors and other writers before him. And so there's never really clear cut, and that there's actually kind of this implicit and explicit network of references.
Was that a statement of value, or is it just an observation?
Both, I guess. That it's nothing kind of exists alone. What I mean? There's no book that exists as a node of itself. That there's knowledge in this of itself, especially in text and other things, connects to other things.
Well, I guess that I'm just making sure who's
who's going on. Okay. My question has to do with Shakespeare. His links, the networks that he was establishing in his works, were implicit.
Yeah.
They were not obvious. Okay. But they could be explicit links. Is there any statement of value between which is more valuable?
No, next slide talks about that a little bit. And so the next other kind of why is this not going? There we go. So the other kind of concept that's talked a lot about in terms of post-structuralism is ideas of decentering and with the death of the author, and that the author themselves, the person who produces the text, is no longer the focus or the center of study or analysis, but instead that they get pushed off to the reader themselves. That it's your subjective interpretation of the meaning, an individual reading of that, is the center of focus and purpose and meaning. It kind of comes from that. That as we want to try to have almost when we want to have less of a center, not have this what do they call it? This kind of not dictatorship, this tyranny of the author in terms of trying to understand his meaning or his intent, his absolute truth in terms of this text, and focusing on how the reader interprets that, and having multiple readers and multiple analysis on top of that text, so that you have multiple different viewpoints and analysis, often contradicting or being very different from one another, and having them all kind of coexist together. And neither one of them is true, but neither one of them really false either. And so there's this kind of idea of kind of pushing towards that, of kind of less focus on the author, more on the reader. And not only that, it's like a blurring between the line between the two. That readers themselves also kind of become authors and are authoring their own subjective views on top of that as well.
So the meaning's in the mind of the beholder.
Yeah, yeah, very much. And there's kind of this blurring of the line between reader and writer. You know what I mean? That there should be kind of this blur between the two. You know, that it's difficult to do. Another big concept, another kind of the other idea that kind of come from this is kind of the history behind us. Many times, in terms of one of the criticisms behind structuralism, but just in any type of category system or in highly structured system, is that a lot of times it takes away or pierces apart history. You know, that it's ahistoric. And Foucault, again, kind of talked about a lot about how the meaning of a symbol or the meaning of ideas change over time. That history is a central part of how we look at something. We can't just put that aside. And that the history also will kind of shows and gives different kind of powers and relationships and kind of molds our identities. And as such, is something that shouldn't be ignored, that we need to focus on the history of how these things change and move over time.
So go ahead, Patrick. You had a comment?
Actually, it was from the last slide, so I don't want to...
No, go ahead. That's perfectly fine.
I was just going to comment that it just makes you wonder how many stories are actually read from a single book as opposed to the one story that's written by the writer. Just how many different stories are there? You know, one person might read it from the perspective of a certain character that they really like versus another character that somebody else likes versus somebody's conceptual idea of what a scene looks like or what a building looks like, or those sorts of things. What are the different stories?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of the got a lot of the focus of how readers themselves are kind of interjecting themselves in those stories. How they a lot of the focus is on being very reflective in terms of who they are. What makes it. What are your experiences? What are your past, your backgrounds, and how that influences the things you read and study and understand. One of the big one of the ideas behind post-structuralism was the understanding that as we try to study something, it's not enough for us just to try to study it. We also have to be aware of how the tools and things inside of us we use to try to understand something and how that impacts and biases us towards certain things, and trying to be very aware and conceptualize of that. That understand that I might focus on certain type of disagreements or focus on certain type of things, and being more reflective in how me as a almost scientific tool of inquiry reacts to different things, and kind of a focus of that.
To be an open vessel.
Yeah, somewhat. And so a big part of Foucault, again, talking about history is very vital and important and shouldn't be ignored. And oftentimes in structured understanding of things, it does get kind of left behind. So that's all I'm going to talk about. Post-structuralism, there's literally tomes and tomes and tomes of books, and the entire class is based on that. But I'd be more than happy to discuss that more later as well. A little focus on hypertext systems. We all know about different hypertext systems. Though what I'm not talking about is just HTML. That's the most popular and globally used hypertext system. There are, of course, many others, and there's many different variations or kind of working up towards one, kind of over the ages and stuff like that. So, of course, we talk about hypertext systems. What really all we're talking about is just different types of text, blocks of words, links, etc. Having different links to one another. People can follow those different links. And this type of this graph of information of text can kind of be followed or kind of linked around. One of the first examples or kind of discussions of a hypertext-like system comes from Vannevar Bush in his famous, oh God, what was the paper called? How We Remember or How We Think?
As We May Think.
As We May think. Thank you. It was this famous paper. Actually, it was in the Atlantic, I believe. It wasn't in a scientific journal, where he discussed this hypothetic machine called the MEMEX, which was, interestingly enough, a hypertext microreal system that would shoot microtext or microfiche or microreel. And you could read inside of that, and then you'd have associated links pointing out to other things that would send off other microfiche reels to you as well. And you could read those. And his big idea was trying to talk about of organizing information and knowledge, that having things organized as a hierarchy might not always be the best way, and that's not how humans think. Oh, in fact, I talked about that in my next slide here. That the human mind doesn't work like a hierarchy, but it works more by association, so that we should be representing our knowledge and information like an associated network instead, and trying to represent this idea through a hypertext system. And his was actually really interesting too. His hypertext system allowed not just for the author to have links that you follow and around, but people reading could annotate on top of that as well and create their own link list and their own kind of bookmark things on top of that others can then follow. And so that blurrization of the author and the reader almost becomes completely blurred, because the readers themselves are coloring and annotating and creating as they read and understand something. Ted Nelson, also a very famous computer scientist, and his explanation of the Xanadu system, which was a precursor, which was also another digital hypertext system. A precursor to the World Wide Web, which I believe actually is somewhat released. It's also talked about as one of the biggest vaporware projects of all time.
He would say it's the web done right.
Yeah, he would. Well, Nelson would say it's the web done right. Everyone else would say it's pretty much vaporware, though there is like a version 0.001 available that I played around with a few months ago. It was interesting. His big thing is where he got off, or I guess where the big differences between the Xanadu system and the World Wide Web was decentralization. Xanadu was very centralized. It had a centralized list of all links pointing to and from somewhere, and anytime you want to change that, you'd update that. His big reason of having this centralized system was that you never have a broken link. At the moment a web page, if you linked to another web page and that web page disappeared, it would show up in the centralized repository, would recognize that and make that link disappear, so that you would never go to an empty page.
So the very thing that
made the web work, yeah. And Tim Berners-Lee instead decided that that's okay to have a mistake, and you just shoot a 404 error instead, and keep it completely decentralized, and that's what worked. That was the 404 was the killer app that allowed the World Wide Web to succeed. And so a lot of the ideas of kind of these hypertext systems kind of realization of the kind of the strengths of this permitting users to find, create, and follow multiple conceptual structures in the same body, and how this is very similar to some of the post-structural understandings of knowledge out of themselves, that having a system where the reader themselves are going through a body of text in their own path, not in a path primarily that the author had intended or had written out for someone, but you can kind of follow your own nose. And by doing that, by following your own kind of path through a hypertext narrative, thereby you're creating your own narrative, thereby you're almost becoming your own author, that it's your journey through the text is what's most important, your perspective and journey through that is what's important, not what necessarily what the author might have intended when he was first creating this hypertext repository.
We choose our own trajectory through a given set of paths.
Yeah, I mean, you think like this happens all the time when you're like Wikipedia. You go there to read about the Queen of Jordan, and an hour later you're reading about, how the Big Whopper got started,
Right.
and you do the whole path between those things.
That's different, though, so I could be reading Shakespeare, okay? I could be reading a version of Shakespeare that's hyperlinked. And I could follow there's there could be some person or concept or place could be linked to, and I have to follow the link that's given. Or maybe there's a couple choices. Or I could be reading Shakespeare, I could search on that concept, and go wherever the hell I want to. There's a difference there.
Yeah, yeah, and it's whether you're creating those links or not, and how you go through that, how you're reading that, and so the way you read that intentionally is going to be very different than how other people are going to be reading that. That no two paths might be the same going through hypertext
Did
narrative.
either of them talk about adding links?
Yes, I mean both Bush talked about adding links in terms of his readers being kind of annotating on top of them. From his original memic system was that. And Nelson as well. Nelson had the whole idea of also of kind of readers annotating, of kind of having your own like trail or something like that, and then sharing that trail with others, possibly. I don't know if they actually had things in terms of actual inserting your own direct links inside of a text itself, like crowdsourcing, like a Wikipedia way of creating something like that. I mean, that's another way of a crowd, creating a hypertext system. I don't believe so, though I might be wrong. I'd have to read close to their things. But it's very possible. He was definitely.
I think Nelson.
Nelson was much more in the business end of things. He had a lot of things in terms of his DRM and making sure that micro payments were going to work, before any of this stuff. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so anyway, oh yeah, go ahead.
So I have a question. Why does working by association and working through a hierarchy why do they have to be mutually exclusive?
You can have an association through a hierarchy, but you're not forced inside of that hierarchy. A hierarchy intrinsically has some type of categorization scheme that whoever created that is forcing upon you. So if I'm saying all animals start from animals and plants, and animals can be birds and reptiles and mammals and whatnot, I'm forcing this hierarchy scheme, this categorization scheme upon you. Whereas the associative list, I can say, well, no, I think plants and slugs are really close together, and I'm going to link them together, even though they're really far apart in this hierarchy.
Okay, but in that scenario, you're just changing the hierarchy. You're not getting rid of any structure altogether. You're just saying, I like what you've done except for this.
Yeah, it can be. Or I can also completely disregard that completely, just saying, my world, the only thing that exists are slugs and plants, and they're related to one another, and that's it. And it's not forcing yourself in that tree-like structure. It's allowing that you can go up and down and sideways and around, and there's no, the hierarchy implies that it's a tree-like structure going down, right? And it's allowing there to be loops, allowing you to be subjectively say that, I'm going to jump around inside of here instead of being forced down this path that someone else created for me.
Another way to think of it is, maybe it's an analogy, is linearity versus non-linearity.
Yeah.
Where you might have a linearity, you might have a story or a lesson that's meant to be delivered in a particular way, and you don't have many options about which way to go. Whereas a nonlinear approach might just leave it wide open. You could follow the lesson any way you want. There's a big argument in constructivists versus non-constructivists, about whether people should be allowed to discover their way through material or be led through the material. It's not exactly the same as hierarchy versus not, but it's a similar sort of.
Yeah.
So I'll buy that for any one subject, but I'm not convinced that a human doesn't have some underlying hierarchy, or at least some of the things he's interested in life, right? So
if you think about the way that the web is set up, though, right? It's not like the file structure on your computer, where the person who created the page decides what folder this file is going to go into. So your individual hierarchy kind of leads you through the links that are not set up according to any structure. So it decenters the person who created the original link.
Sure. But I think the thing there was that humans don't use, or maybe I misunderstood.
No, that is. But I don't believe that all humans have a complete hierarchy through that. We have a lot of the knowledge inside of our heads isn't organized like a file system. We've shown that many times. We have weird association between things that don't really have any weird categorization. There's a lot of things where we hold contradictory ideas to be true at the same time. I might lie to someone and at the same time think I'm still a good person, but I know lying is bad, but it doesn't really matter because I'm still good. And there's a bazillion ethical reasons and stuff like that. There's many different examples of how we hold knowledge in our head.
Yeah, in that case, that's something that that you go through or that you might deal with on a daily basis. Something like telling a white lie or something like that. But for let's say you've learned. Biology is probably a pretty good example. If you're not a biologist, you learned about how these things are classified, whether it was forced on you or not. That's how it's then stored in your brain, unless you are playing with it every day and it's constantly fresh in your mind, and you work with it enough to create your own, as you say, individual network or learning path through it, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's largely a convenience thing. If somebody else packages it for you in a way that you think is nice, humans are lazy and they're not going to do more work than they absolutely have to remember something.
But that's still not a hierarchy, I don't think. And I think even from that, that's how research and discoveries are made, is finding the weird association between things that we didn't think at first were there. And that's how we think. So I might think about things in biology in a certain passive understanding, but I might remind myself of, oh, that's really similar to like this concept in chemistry that's like this. Or it reminds me of this concept in baseball, or for some reason when I was 5 and I cut my hand, and that's why my bleed, it stops eventually. You know what I mean? And for some reason now, whenever I think about clotting, I think about the time that I dropped a knife on my hand when I was 5 or something like that. And it's just really weird association lists. I think our mind works much more like Wikipedia than the encyclopedia.
Yeah, maybe even in most cases, I'm just not sold that there's no existence of that kind of.
No, and I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it's like a blended system. Even Wikipedia has hierarchies and categorization schemes inside of it. You know what I mean? It's a mix. I wouldn't. Yeah, and I'd say that's perfectly valid. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That's all I'm saying.
Cool. So this is this little slide, some of that kind of showing a little bit of relationship between hypertext and linked data, and kind of showing it's just one step above. So if we talk about all these ideas and concepts of hypertext systems, and in particular I'm going to focus just on the World Wide Web and HTML. We have 2 different web documents. They both have a name. They're named by using a URI. And you can have a relationship between the 2 concepts, between a hyperlink between them. This web page here has a hyperlink, this href, blah, 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 to this other web page. Linked data, or even lower than it, just RDF itself, takes just one step further and says, hey, what instead of in World Wide Web, all links are completely the same. There's no name, there's no concept, there's nothing behind that link. They're all exactly the same as one another, even though from a semantic viewpoint, those links mean different things inside of the actual content of that page. What if we represented that a little bit? What if we started naming some of these links? What if I said that this link actually has a name or has a meaning or means something to me? And what if I named that the same way I name everything on the web through using a URL? What if I name that concept using URI? And that guy gives us kind of the triple, this source document linking towards something else, and that link having a name, having a concept side of itself, this idea of just base RDF. And we can go a little further than that. We can start now describing other concepts ideas. I can have this idea of this person named James Hendler, and he has a job, and his job is a professor. He has a workplace, and that workplace has a web page. And we can start describing kind of some of the knowledge, some of the information behind that. And even take a little step further, I can say, well, there's relationships between these different concepts. I can say the 2 different concepts are related to one another. They might actually be the same thing, or they're kind of similar. I can say this idea of DBpedia Hendler, Jim Hendler, who has this information about him, about an occupation and all this other stuff, is the same concept as this other idea of Jim Hendler, this other Hendler that's been described somewhere else. And he also has a title, and he has a workplace. And I have a little more complex graph going on. This is kind of the idea of linked data I'm sure we've all heard a million times to death by now, of kind of linking different ideas and concepts and data together. Basically trying to say that making data itself work like the web does, and kind of express it like such.
Is linked data new to anybody?
Yes, it is. Do I really need to go in further description, or? Okay, cool. So I'm not going to spend much more time on that. And just a quick other thing, kind of just 2 more slides, and kind of how Jim kind of views linked data and a little bit I do. And here's, if you haven't yet received his 2 Towers talk in terms of semantic web and linked data, there's kind of the linked data is just one thing, or linked data kind of is, but the semantic web isn't just one thing. It's a spectrum of different technologies and different philosophy scopes. And so something else I'm adding into the discussion a little bit. This is a little separate from what I talked about before in terms of whether linked data is post-structural or is similar to hypertext. And this idea of these two poles in the spectrum of the semantic web, whether that similarity between the two, they come from what's interesting is the history and the philosophical traditions behind those are very, very different from one another. In fact, it kind of coincides a bit with the analytic continental divide in philosophy a bit, and they both kind of come from those different schools almost. And so it's just something interesting to note, and just something I kind of wanted to bring up to talk about. So one hand being very much in the big O, or the hard ontology world, the ALDL world, the more description logic, having these very powerful descriptive ways of talking about the rules, the categorization, the cardinality of different data and systems and ideas. But they're also very fragile in terms of any type of contradictions or any type of inconsistencies inside of those. Can really kind of wreck these systems and can cause a lot of troubles if you do any type of reasoning on top of them. I don't know why I have 2 slides of that. That's interesting. Okay, and then the other side, a kind of little smaller O ontology, of that of using different fragments of different languages, different types of smaller vocabularies, finding different interesting ways to link those together. Having not being so concerned with the rigid consistency of this, but allowing and embracing somewhat the inconsistency, the different ideas, and having kind of small agreements between these different communities of vocabularies, of information, of data, and a little bit more of kind of the more linked data, the more web-like approach to information and knowledge representation. So kind of the 2 different poles. More from the side of kind of the web and structuralism and some of these other ideas, kind of the continental philosophy, kind of influence some of the ideas and technologies behind more of the linked data side, and more of the ideas of knowledge representation and knowledge engines that kind of came a lot from some of the ideas and concepts from more of the analytic philosophy, kind of influenced more of the big O approach to this, and kind of where these kind of things meet in the middle. So it's just kind of an interesting anecdote to kind of add into that of some of the philosophical traditions behind the semantic web. So that's really all I have. I didn't really prepare much more. I just want to kind of define and talk a little bit about some of these concepts and ideas that I've been kind of wrestling around with and playing with, and anyone else's ideas, concepts, want to argue, want to add, and I kind of just opened up for anyone else.
Just dealing with the big O versus little O ontology. It's been my perception, and probably that of lots of people, that the notion of semantic web was slow to take off in that 2001 article, because when in fact the kit for linked data existed back then. Everything that we needed, except for perhaps Sparkle, rubber-double form, existed 14 years ago.
Yeah.
But there was a feeling at that time that we needed this big O.
Yeah. Yeah.
In order to make it successful, because there was a feeling that what we were really after was inference, all these tools. Whereas when the sort of the TBL and others sort of ripped the blinders off and said, no, what we really need is just these very simple assertions between things. That's all we really need.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how that ties in, or is that just echoing what you said?
I think so. I mean, I think it's coming more to that realization. You know what I mean? That the reason why the web worked was because of some of these more light, structured ways that we look at things. You know, the fact that it was decentralized, it was very easy to get up and going, and it didn't try to overstructure, overdo the type of things that Nelson wanted. I think it's almost the reason why Nelson lost in TBL1 in terms of the global hypertext system, and almost making that mistake in terms of making his giant global graph vision, and going towards so much of the structured things and almost losing some of that decentrality and you know, kind of disagreement and kind of you know, decentral nature and stuff like that, that I guess Big O kind of enforces down on you.
You could have, I mean, you could also, there's others you could have included. You know, there's Bush, there's Nelson, at almost the exact same time that Tim Berners-Lee was forming his ideas and starting to socialize them. There were people like University of Graz, Herman Mahler, with Hyper-G, which was a much more impressive hypertext system.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was doing stream video in '95.
Yeah. You have like Wendy and her link base and stuff like that, and other things out of Southampton. Yeah.
But all of those were perfectly engineered and controlled systems.
Yeah.
And whereas HTTP, HTML were very simple, partially developed.
Yeah, very
and
messy.
readily discoverable.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
There's also a question of aim, right? The bigger people are aiming for something. People are, for the most part, trying to build a web where people can access lots of different types of knowledge, versus the big O are aiming for the kind of after things.
That's correct, but I don't think people who were building on the semantic web stack knew that there was a simpler thing to aim for. I guess that's the point. We didn't know about necessarily that maybe they took the literal O for granted, but didn't realize that to do all these other interesting things, we didn't need for everything else to be done.
Yeah. I think it's also competing in how we organize and construct the world. You know, how we do sort of. I think what they're both aiming to do is structure knowledge in some type of way, information. You mean, and they wanted something more than hypertext, but they almost went too far in terms of that, in terms of wanting to structure more than what hypertext just allowed. But it's all about knowledge structuring in some way. And I think that's where they were both competing in that, where both competing worldviews and how we construct knowledge. And I think that argument between those two goes all the way back to the same arguments we see in, you know, the continental versus analytical, you know, debates, you know.
So you hear people talking about the value of serendipity, and serendipity and linked data. You know, if we publish data, for example, that's done, linked data done well, that provides an opportunity to explore, to follow our nose, and to go places we never anticipated. And to go places that the creator didn't necessarily anticipate.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Rather than trying to enforce structure, right? Rather than trying to, I'm trying to pick another analogy. The multiple meanings of the book.
Yeah.
Okay. The author might have, you know, there are authors who would welcome any interpretation of the book. You know, go wherever it takes you, however you understand it. That's great, right? And there are authors who, you know, this is what I meant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can definitely see, you know, kind of things like that. I think a lot of times in especially in the literature and some of the post-structural literature, they talk a lot about play being a very important element in terms of understanding and coming to understanding and certain phenomena, and having a type of system or having type of environment and a way of looking at things that enables play, that enables that serendipity, that enables you know, kind of playing in and outside of structure. You know, kind of Derrida talks a bit about that. And I think in HyperText Systems, it allows you to do that. You know, how many times have people played around, you know, Wikipedia and just kind of felt around and just got around to different things and saw weird connections they might not have seen before, or find weird relationships, or learn something brand new an hour later that they had no idea. But there is a connection by the very fact that they stayed on the site. There is a path between those two weird concepts.
So here's a concept. Most of us deal with scientific data. You know, and most of us think about the publication of scientific data. Peter Fox one of his definitions of data science is doing science with other people's data. That's kind of the classic definition. When you talk to scientists who are responsible for creating that data and getting the first results from that data, sometimes it's a shocking idea that somebody else might draw other conclusions from their data or combine their data with other data and reach different conclusions.
Yeah.
And or this notion of presenting data in a way that's different than so simply presenting the data in a way that allows for it to be explored in a way that they didn't anticipate. And that's not necessarily a control thing. Okay, that's so that it's sort of this is all leading up to the question: do you think there are cases where data or structure must be enforced in order to have it properly presented?
That's a good question.
Here's this data. If I put what's that? Yeah, but I think it still sees you. It's not completely asleep. It's just its eyes are glowing.
It still is.
Well, we're still on. I can see you waving. What I mean is that maybe it's a sequence. So let's use that a time series data. There are ways that we could encode that data to where we could specify a particular the fact that it's a time series, the fact that it was generated in a particular sequence. Okay, analyzed in that same way, a particular conclusion could be drawn. If that data was explored associatively by something, could that lead to some wrong, irrelevant conclusion? That's and does that matter? I mean, it could lead to an interesting conclusion, a wrong conclusion. Should the scientists have any say in that?
Peter always shows an example of spatial data in the classes that he teaches that demonstrate how maybe not that structure is necessary, but that it at least contains extra information that you might even consider more data that goes along with whatever else you have. So there's he shows basically like two geotiff images or something like that, and one of them is like sort of flat, and the other one has lots of peaks and that sort of thing. And then he shows like a histogram of the height as within certain ranges. How many points are within a certain range of elevation? And the histograms for the two look nearly identical, and you would just looking from that sort of information, you would say, oh, these are the same geotiff thing, but you're throwing out the spatial information there because you're ignoring the fact that, yeah, this one has maybe the same amount of points at this elevation as this one does, but they're all over here in this one as opposed to being spread out in this one. So in that scenario, I feel like the structure of that data, the spatial structure that's inherent to it, is almost like more information in and of itself, more data. So you don't necessarily, I guess, have to view it as a hierarchy or something being forced upon you. It's just extra information that's helping you, and then you plot it however you want.
This is part of that whole package. It's not
right.
It's
not separable from the data. Really.
So it's sort of like exploring, but keeping that context with you as you go down that particular path to look at it in that particular way.
You have to take it into consideration.
Yeah. Right. And when presenting it, that's part of the presentation as well.
And I think you're actually touching on one of the big problems and criticisms of post-structuralism. Is one of the reasons it's great is because it destroys or attempts to destroy these like possibly hegemonic, oppressive, rigid power systems, right? Like fight the power, and everyone has their individual right to say things, and that's awesome. The problem is that sometimes if you take that too far, it becomes everything is treated equally when things aren't necessarily equal. So I mean, thinking about how can we use data in different ways, and maybe we shouldn't be. Instead of like data structure, think of categorization, and think of the anti-vax debates right now. Right? We have people who are saying, well, there's mercury in vaccines, and I don't want mercury in my body. That's true data. That's correct. Independent of the fact that it's a different type of mercury and it's actually negligible and stuff like that. But that interpretation of that data that they're presenting as their argument is technically true, but we see the problems when that type of interpretation gets spread, right? With all the problems that are coming out of the anti-vax measles cases outbreaking and things like that. You see the same thing with global warming debates. So you take these models and you can interpret them in different ways, and then suddenly we're still pumping tons and tons of carbon into the air when maybe we shouldn't be. So.
I don't think there's any problem with vaccines. They're great systems. Nobody's old enough to get the joke.
So the discussion that we just had, right? So I actually previously asked some thoughts why the big data has not been applied so widely. So if we try to make an analogy, so I think the best data publication tool that we ever had in this world is probably the RFC cell, because it is so simple, it is so intuitive that we all can understand how the data is structured. But for the big data, because the structure is sometimes too complicated, or people have different ways to interpret it, therefore it might take a lot more effort to reuse somebody else's data. But for the Excel sheet, because it's very simple, very easy to understand, therefore people tend to reuse it. Therefore, I'm thinking about whether it's the case that we don't really have a data publication tool, including data, which causes the problem that data has not been reused so much, because we don't understand how the data is structured. At least not as intuitive as we see on the Excel sheet.
Do you think that's a problem of the structure or the tools that we have? Because I feel the World Wide Web is structured the same way, but no one has any issue understanding the World Wide Web or using a browser and going around every day.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the same. It's structured exactly the same way. It's a giant graph. You know what I mean?
But so as a web browser, it's just a very intuitive interpretation of the data in backend, right? So it's a way of public the data. Right? So it's not something like terminal that's not really easy for people to understand, but using web browser, maybe the data is easier to be understood by normal human beings. So similar as in the Excel sheet, because it's very intuitive for most people to understand, and therefore it's been widely used. So the CSV file has been widely used.
I think in support of what you're saying, I've found that the absolute easiest way to explain both the concept of linked data and RDF itself is to use the metaphor of the cell in an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Because so many people are familiar, they understand what a row means, you know, what they understand what a column means, they understand what the intersection between that is, and so you immediately have this. So when they then see what this means. They visualize these assertions. They visualize this triple as a cell. It all has meaning.
Yeah.
And each part of it has meaning. And so I think there is something just inherently understandable about that. And I also think if Tim Lebo were here right now, he would probably more than any of us, he's spent time with that mapping between those two, mapping, but and not just the simple tabular structure, but also time series represented in Excel, and how that translates. And so there's that it's a very powerful thing, which is probably why, as you say, everybody uses it. Everybody keeps going back to it. It communicates a lot. So, other points? So there's been more discussion in this Twed than we've had in a long time, and I'm really looking forward to. I want to thank Dominic for putting himself on the line, both to be the first discussion of the term, and also for bringing up this topic. It's a pretty heady topic. I hope you got ideas.
Yeah, another plan.
Because this is tied into Dominic's dissertation work, so we're helping him out here. Go ahead, man.
In that case, it might be worth pointing out the little O analogy actually is incorrect, because so in the story in the Bible, the Tower of Babel, people spoke the same language before they were building it.
And it's the curse of God who made them all speak different languages.
Yeah,
yes. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but the point was, that afterwards they still.
But they didn't build it anymore afterwards, because that was the whole point, was that the confusion between them stopped the progress on the building.
Well, you can talk to Jim about that. That's not my analogy.
So I wonder. So Jim knows what he's doing,
and he knows his Bible.
Sure as hell knows that heritage.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if
he has a Bible verse inside of that they took out. There is a Bible verse he referenced.
I'm wondering if.
Where is it?
I think what we is that people do not need to speak the same language in order to continue building that tower. If they have that little ontological agreement, they can come back and.
They can come back and just continue building.
Yeah, right. So he's saying to build a tower, you don't need what they needed. They need it. Yeah, and look how fragile they were. They had to have one language.
Yeah, because in the Bible it looks like people have to share the same language in order to work together.
Yes.
It's not the case according to that often.
Right. Well, and there's another thing which I think. So I love the notion of things growing organically, or complex systems, self-directed complex systems. It's for real. It's the way things work. And I think that the systems that rely on centralized control, that rely on big scaffolds, big structures, they may have some success, but they don't scale. They inherently don't scale. Whereas systems that can tolerate a lot of error or a lot of lack of that control, such as being one of those people in 1993 and 1994 who learned how to code for the web by viewing source. This is how we all did it. We couldn't find manuals for how to do this. We saw something. We saw how somebody coded something. We looked at their code, and the expression was we snarfed it up. We just did that, hacked it, and it was kind of amusing. Like there would be trends. There would be like, oh, everybody's doing this now. Oh, that's very cool. Oh, look at that. You can do a mouse over and it'll change colors. But what allowed that to happen and allowed the web to be durable and allowed these small changes was this not a lot of specification and just a lot of, which is why we're still at HTTP 1.1. But that's amazing. That really is amazing. The web celebrated 25 years from HTTP 1.1. And that's not a testimony to slowness, but a testimony to some simple ideas which propagated. And they haven't changed TCP/IP. That hasn't been changed for a while. Most of the changes to HTML5 have been There's been clarifications. There's been adding features. There's been a lot of debate. Every time there's a proposal for a change, there's like, don't introduce more complexity because it'll spoil the web. Will break the web. Don't do it. And most of the RFC, most of the, not RFCs, but recommendations that haven't got a lot of traction, if you look at those, there's a lot of specification there. People are trying to force certain things to happen. Christine and I were talking about some privacy-related specifications that have evolved since 2002. And a lot of them are very heavy-handed. Very heavy-handed, and they're novel. There's a lot of features in it, but they assume somebody wants to have a lot of control. So I think this is it. Let's give Dominic applause. And a reminder, 2 weeks, the future of privacy. No. And this is going to be wide open. This is going to be, bring your preconceived notions about privacy, bring your ignorance of privacy, bring your rants about privacy. Bring it on.
Be careful.
Yeah, no. Well, we really want to open it up. And even think out of the box, think about things like Internet of Things, think about social networks, think about those sorts of things. It's going to be, we really want it to be a wild-ass conversation. Got that? Got that? All right, that's it.